Hey everyone, hope you're doing well. So I'm going to look at a game between Magnus Carlsen and Wang Hao, played in the year 2011 in the Tata Steel Group A Wijk and Say match. And in this game, Magnus was playing with the white pieces, Wang Hao black. And both players were actually quite young at this moment in time. It was about 9 years ago. And we get a Caro-Kann with Magnus playing the move e4. Black plays c6. There was d4, d5, e5, and bishop to f5. We get to the advanced variation in the Caro-Kann. And Magnus plays a rare move, plays bishop to e3, secures the d4 pawn, sort of stops black from playing the move c5. But black gets a good game. He plays e6, and we get a sort of French position where the bishop is outside of the pawn chain by black. So it's quite a strong bishop for black in the Caro-Kann. Magnus played knight to d2 to develop, black plays knight d7 to develop, again knight to f3 developing, bishop g6, and this leaves some space for black now to play knight to e7 to f5, Magnus plays bishop to e2, and black does play knight to e7. And to stop this now Magnus plays knight to h4, so covers the f5 square with the knight and also attacks the bishop on g6. So at any moment this white knight could take the bishop. White's got to be a bit careful with discoveries on this knight if this knight for black ever moves away. But these are two grandmasters, so they'll easily see that move. Typically now black does play knight to f5 in many of the games. And then white should just take it. And black recaptures, white should castle. And in many of the games after bishop to e7, white usually plays f4. Castles, and actually white plays a4 in this position, but I was also tempted, maybe you could play g4 if you're feeling brave. But back to the actual game. In the game after knight to h4, Wang Hao played now c5, and we get a really good French sort of setup here, forcing Magnus to play c3 to secure his d4 pawn, and black now plays knight to c6, and this is the French structure. We've got the e6 pawn here, d5, c5, the queen comes to b6. The only problem, actually not a problem, but a great advantage is the bishop is outside of the pawn chain. Typically it's usually situated on c8. But this bishop is so good that white now decides to take it off. Knight takes g6 by Magnus. Black recaptures with the h-pawn. So some for compensation, the fact that now black has the open h-file. So maybe they could stir up some counterplay with this open file. But Magnus now plays knight to f3, secures d4. And white's got a very solid position. Black's also doing quite well here. Rook c8 to gain the open file if it ever becomes open. So if black ever takes on d4 and white recaptures with the c-pawn, this rook could become quite dangerous. Magnus though castles kingside. Not too scared by this rook on the open h-file because this knight does a great job. It covers the g5 square and this h4 square, stops this black queen from infiltrating the position. Black now plays a6, prepares to move b5, and Magnus plays g3, preparing h4 just to lock down this h-file. Also I should mention this bishop does a great job of securing this square. The knight will secure this square, and once the pawn gets to h4, the g5 square is locked down and there's no way for black to break through on this side of the board. He tries with bishop to e7, but h4, as I say, now he's got three pieces covering this g5 square, and black's only got the queen and the bishop to protect this square, so there's no chance of black pushing this pawn up anymore. b5 was played now by black, so at least they've got space advantage on the queen side. But this is a typical top level move now that Magnus plays, a4. So trying to break up the pawn structure, it forces black now to make a decision. In the game he played queen b6, but I'll just demonstrate. If black decided to take this pawn off, for instance now Magnus could just play bishop takes a6 and black's pawn structure is obliterated. Again c4 is possible, but maybe after a takes b5, a takes b5, white has the move b4, just locking everything down, and white's got a significant space advantage here. Okay, yeah, black could en passant here, but I think white just takes this b5 pawn off the board and will probably hoover up this b3 pawn next move. So Wang Hao plays the correct move after Magnus plays a4, plays queen b6, just reinforcing his b5 pawn. and Magnus just takes A takes B5, A takes B5, and now at least White's got an open A file to cause some havoc. But again, Magnus plays a very strong move here, and I think maybe 2000 plus players would play this. He played king to G2. So what he's doing is he's just going to reroute his rook to H1 and try and gain some counterplay with the push H5. The queen side is pretty much locked down for both sides, so it makes sense to attack on the king side. The king's actually pretty safe on G2. And now I think Wang Hao made a mistake. He played C4. B4 was probably the best option because it creates some tension in the centre and also threatens to play maybe even B3 here or C4. It'd be very nice if Black could get a pawn on this B3 square, because then you can cause some problems on this A2 square. And you see AlphaZero and LilyChess0 doing this quite a lot and with some good results. But if B4, Rook H1 seems natural for White. And as I say, if B3, maybe White could take on C5 here. And if Black recaptures, White could solidify with Bishop to D4, Queen C7. But this is a completely different game. Some interesting ideas here. So maybe Black could have gone in for this. In the game though, after King to G2, Black locked everything down with the move C4. The problem with this move is it's got no counterplay now for Black. All his pieces are on this side of the board, and this bishop is probably pointed in this side. I get it helps with this side, but basically Black's got two pieces on the king side, and now Magnus just exploits this massively. So he plays knight to G5. A very strong piece now, infiltrating Black's camp. Okay, yeah, Black could take it, but then comes bishop takes G5. And I was looking at the move F6 to see if this was any good for Black, but after takes, and bishop to F4, let's say King F7 and Rook E1. I've highlighted these green squares. White may be able just to plonk the bishop onto D6 and then just manoeuvre it back to A3. And look at all the squares that this bishop will control. And also this bishop on E2 becomes strong after it could go to G4 and attack this E6 pawn with the rook. So this is really good for White because White's got the two bishops. And you'll hear many grandmasters talk about having the two bishops in the endgame. And they are significantly stronger than two knights in many more positions. Alright, so going back to the game. Knight G5 has just been played. Wang Hao now played queen to D8, so getting the queen back into a more defensive role, and Magnus just plays bishop G4, and this is a sort of caveman-like. Basically all he wants to do is play bishop takes E6, followed by knight takes E6, and it could even... The point with this move is that once the knight gets to E6, it will hit the queen, hit the G7 pawn, so even... It's not really a sacrifice because White gains 3 pawns out of it, so it'll be a good position for White. The computer recommended playing knight to F8 to defend this E6 pawn, but maybe Wang Hao was worried about queen to F3 here because now the F7 pawn is under attack. For instance, let's say Black plays bishop takes G5, there's bishop takes G5, queen D7, and H5 was given by the engine. And after takes, White's got a very nice position with the two bishops. At any point, it looks as though White's going to crash through. And yeah, just a very pleasant position for White to be in if this occurred. Back to the game though, Black actually took the knight off. So bishop takes G5 was played. There was bishop takes and queen C7. And Magnus plays Rook H1. Simple idea. Just to open up everything now with H5. And there's not really anything Black can do. So Black tries some counterplay, knight to B6. Magnus crashes in though with H5. Captures occurs, bishop takes, and as we see again, these two bishops are ridiculously strong, and these knights aren't really doing anything. Black does try some counterplay, knight to A4, attacks B2. Also locks down the A file, so maybe there's no more Rook A7 ideas or Rook A6 ideas for White. But this doesn't really matter, because now Magnus comes up with a genius move, as always. Pause the video if you like and see if you can find it. I'll give you a few seconds, but Magnus, see if you can find out what Magnus played. So in this position, Magnus now played the great move. I think it's quite obvious to many strong players, but he just played bishop takes f7 with check. And so this unleashes the rook on h1, so black's got to be quite careful. For instance, they can't just take this off with the queen, because then just rook takes h8 will be played with check, and all of a sudden white's got a great position and wins the exchange at least. So in the game, black is forced to take with the king. King takes f7 is played, and Magnus plays queen f3 with check. And black's actually just completely lost. And it's amazing actually that Magnus figured out all these impressive variations, because they're quite hard to see actually. Because I was looking at king g6 and how to follow up. So how does white follow up here? Well, the best move actually is this move, bishop f6. This looks really weird. And there's quite a few variations to go through here. Because let's say black takes this off. Obviously the quickest variation is queen takes f6, checkmate, so we can't take it. But if black takes on h1, white's got to recapture. Obviously, and now he's threatening queen h5 checkmate. So after king to f7, there's queen h5 with check. If king g8 here, white just wins with queen h8 check, king f7, takes on g7, king e8 and rook h8 is checkmate. So the best move after queen h5 is actually just to play g6. But even so, after this, white should now just play queen g4, threatening rook h7. And there's no way to stop white winning the queen. So that's pretty much game over. So if obviously king g6, the best move was bishop to f6. And it's impressive that Magnus saw this. In the game though, black played king to g8, so protecting the rook on h8, this is the most logical move. But Magnus now just finishes black off. There's rook takes h8 with check, king takes is forced, and now there's rook to h1 with check, and king g8 is the only move. And now Magnus plays queen h5. So there's a nice threat here of just bishop to f6 once again. In the game, rook f8 was played, and after bishop to f6, Wang Hao resigned the game, because now Magnus is threatening to play queen to h8 with check and queen takes g7, and there's no real way to stop this. I looked at rook takes f6 here. If pawn takes, again we just get queen h8, king to f7 and rook h7 check, king g6, and white just picks up the queen. So going back to queen h5, there was no other way to stop this really. So rook f8 was played by Wang Hao in the game. I looked at some desperate attempts, I'll be honest. Knight takes e5 was one desperate attempt. If this occurred though, white can just take, queen takes, queen h8, king f7, and just pick up the rook on c8, and white should the whole rook up. Another desperate attempt was maybe knight to e7 here. If this occurred, there's bishop takes, and queen h8 once again, king f7, and we'll pick up the rook as well. Last attempt I looked at was knight to b6. And this is what Magnus must have seen. He played bishop to f6, he would have played bishop to f6. And if this happens, if g takes f6, queen h8 check, king f7, and now rook h7 check, king g6. We can take the queen if we wanted to, but there's actually a mate here with rook h6, king f7, and rook takes f6. And after a few more moves, it's checkmate. So this was a brilliant game played by Magnus 9 years ago. I was actually reading this on the Chess Games website, and it says that people have said that Wang Hao didn't really play very well, or that he just didn't try. But let's be honest, this move's pretty amazing, bishop takes f7. Magnus just made a 27-30 player look really amateurish, and I doubt many other players could do this. So I think it's unfair to say that Wang Hao played badly, because he actually had a decent position throughout the game. It's just that Magnus knew exactly what sort of elements to play in this sort of position. So it's actually ridiculously good with this h5 move. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed my analysis of this game. If you did, please do drop a like, comment, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.